I find out of all the Godzilla universes, out of all of the eras, I find the 70s era films the most fascinating. Hello YouTube, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions, and welcome to the next episode of the Godzilla Vlogs, where we discuss everything and anything Godzilla. Today we're going to be talking about the 70s Godzilla series. Now let me make something very clear. We all know that there are the Showa series of Godzilla films, which were made in the 50s. Made in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Then we have the Heisei series, which was made in the late 80s and through the 90s. And then we have the Millennium series made from the 2000s onwards. Those are the main, eras, I guess we could say. I like to classify it down a little bit further, especially with the Showa series. The Showa series has a lot more stuff in it that I like to kind of look at. You have early Showa, which was made from 54 with the original Godzilla all the way to 61 with Mothra. And then we have the 60s era, which goes from 62 with King Kong vs. Godzilla through Destroy All Monsters. Then we have the 70s era, which goes from 1970 to 1975, of course. And this kind of goes not just for, films in general. I shouldn't have said 1975, I meant 1977, really. Because of a movie called War in Space, which was the last true hurrah for Toho. We'll get into reasons why a little bit later. But those are kind of the breakdown of the eras. Notice how I left out Godzilla's Revenge. That's because I believe Godzilla's Revenge isn't really a Godzilla film. Maybe we'll discuss that for another video. The 60s Godzilla films kind of have a continuity. They do, but it's very loose anyways. And then the 70s series have their own kind of continuity. Because it really isn't until really Godzilla vs. Hedorah does Godzilla truly become a superhero. I mean, we have the other films, sure, but I mean, let's look at it. He becomes a hero at the end of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Then he is kind of mind-controlled throughout the entire film and naturally fights King Ghidorah at the ending of Invasion of the Astro Monster. He's not really a bad guy, but he's not really a good guy in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, and that's the same in Son of Godzilla. And then we have Destroy All Monsters. And Destroy All Monsters, he's controlled by the Kilox, and then all of a sudden he fights King Ghidorah. And then he goes after the aliens, who they consider his natural enemy. He's not really a good guy per se. I mean, he's not the bad guy he was, but he's not really a good guy. It isn't until Godzilla vs. Hedorah does he really become the friend to all humans. There's a reason for that. That's because if you look at it throughout the late 60s and through the 70s, the Japanese film industry was in a heavy decline. I mean, even one of Akira Kurosawa films bombed at the box office. I mean, it was getting that bad, and a lot of that had to do with television, the advent of television, and in shows like Ultraman and Ultra Q and all those shows were really taking a toll on science fiction films in general. And by the 70s, Toho had completely broken up. Before this, Toho, I discussed this more in great detail in my review for Space Amoeba, for Shiro Honda-thon. Go check that out if you will, plug. Toho, at one time, was like, they controlled everything with an iron fist. They controlled the actors, they controlled the directors, they controlled the producers, they controlled everything. But that kind of broke up because they couldn't afford it, because of how much they were losing seats to television. Because a lot of people were saying, well, why should I have to pay for this in theater when I can basically get it for free at my own home? Right now we're going through something similar in the fact we have movies and TV, and then we have the internet. The internet is kind of taking over, or it's taking away from movies. So we have that kind of debacle going on right now. Something similar did happen here in the United States too, but it happened during the 1950s and early 1960s. Again, Japan is kind of like a decade behind us in many ways, or at the time was kind of like a decade behind us. For example, they just started getting into color during the 1950s. Not only was the West getting into color, but we were also getting into widescreen during the 50s. Japan didn't start getting into widescreen until really the 1960s. Sure, we have some outliers, don't get me wrong, but they were mainly for fantasy films, fantastic films, or epics like the Akira Kurosawa films. But why I find the 70s series so fascinating is because those movies had almost no budget at all. The lack of budget with those films made the 60s Godzilla films look like colossal epics. And that's why in the 70s series, we unfortunately have a lot of stock footage, specifically in Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Megalon. I personally think it was done a lot worse in Godzilla vs. Gigan. But what makes me, from a filmmaker standpoint, what makes me so fascinated with that is because these films had such a low budget, but yet they tried to do something new with it. The result in these films, especially in Godzilla vs. Hedorah and Godzilla vs. Gigan, the result was very artistic decisions that quite frankly looked amazing. Because of, I discussed this a little bit in the future of the Legendary's Godzilla franchise, but basically I believe that art relies on restrictions. You have a set budget, you have to film something in that certain budget, you have to be creative with how to use the camera because of said budget. That's where the art comes out. A perfect example of this is watch Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. That film had a very small budget, and yet it looked grand and amazing. You see, Destroy All Monsters was supposed to be supposed to be the end-all be-all Godzilla film, and they were going to end, Toho was going to end their kind of Godzilla run right there and then. And there were a lot of film festivals that were made at around this time to get children involved, and they were huge successes. They were basically cut down, watered down versions of the 60s Godzilla films that were being released. And also Ultraman was a huge success and everything like that, which is why we got Jet Jaguar, for Christ's sakes. And because those were huge successes and children were still going out in droves to see these movies, Toho, being in a very questionable economic situation, where they were almost ready to close their doors, said, let's make a bunch of cheap movies that we know are going to be, quite frankly, successful. And they looked for franchises and stuff like that and said Godzilla is one of them. Another one that they did was, believe it or not, Dracula, which I would love to talk about those films eventually. But they made 3 Dracula films called the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, and they made those specifically to earn a couple extra bucks, quite frankly, to keep their doors open a little while longer. And what's interesting is that Tomoyuki Tanaka with Godzilla vs. Hedorah did kind of the same thing he did with the original Godzilla. For the record, I love Godzilla vs. Hedorah. That is my favorite of the 70s series. It's one of my favorite Showa films of all time. I love that film. It was my first Godzilla movie. I'm not afraid to admit that. But Tomoyuki Tanaka went to Ishiro Honda for the original Godzilla because he was a newcomer. He showed potential. And Yoshimitsu Banno, the director of Godzilla vs. Hedorah, was kind of the same thing. He was a co-director for a lot of films, just like Ishiro Honda was for Akira Kurosawa. And he showed potential. And what happened was, so he starts to direct, and he co-writes the screenplay for Godzilla vs. Hedorah with Takashi Kimura, who is a Godzilla veteran who wrote many films, and his films usually tend to be a lot darker. He wrote Destroy All Monsters, my favorite film that he's actually written. There's 2 of them. He wrote the original Rodan, and he wrote War of the Gargantuas to kind of show the thematic elements that he usually did. And Godzilla vs. Hedorah, out of all the 70s one, is definitely one of the darkest. I think the darkest is Terra Mechagodzilla, but in terms of theme-wise, and aesthetically and stuff like that, Godzilla vs. Hedorah is definitely the darkest. And that film had such a small budget that they had to be very creative with how to show things. And because they didn't have the time either to edit it, they had to be very creative with the use of sound effects and everything. Like, a lot of people don't know this, but even Hedorah's roar was a stock roar. Hedorah's roar was actually the stock roar of a frog-like monster from Ultraman. If somebody knows the name of that monster, please put it down in the description. Everything in that film was really used in another Toho film and just kind of thrown into this film, including the Godzilla suit. By this time, the Godzilla suit was in heavy disrepair, but yet they used it anyways. And that becomes even more prominent in Godzilla vs. Gigan. But anyways, what's interesting is that Tomoyuki Tanaka at this time was kind of having like a mental breakdown because of the amount of stress he was going through with Toho. Because he didn't like some of the decisions that the upper heads at Toho were making, and they disagreed with him, but yet they kept him on. It was a huge debacle. And Tomoyuki Tanaka was actually sick when he saw a rough cut of Godzilla vs. Hedorah, and he fucking hated it. He fucking hated it. And he told Yoshimi Tsubano that he's never going to make another movie for Toho again, nor did he ever do it again. He never made really another movie after this. He did work on several screenplays, though. Most prominently, he worked on the screenplay for Prophecies of Nostradamus, which is a very controversial film and a very mixed bag film, in my opinion. However, Godzilla vs. Hedorah was a huge success. Not just in Japan, but also here in the United States. It sold tickets in drove. And it wasn't received critically well, and though I'm glad it's getting the final praises that it deserves now, it wasn't critically successful, but it made a lot of money, and that's all Toho cared about. However, it was so bizarre and so weird that that's one reason why the critics didn't like it. And so they got rid of Yoshimi Tsubano and brought in Jun Fukuda. And Jun Fukuda wound up directing the next 3 in the series. He directed Gigan, Megalon, and Mechagodzilla. Ishiro Honda had quit Toho at this time, quite frankly, because of the whole debacle in Space Amoeba. Again, if you want to know the whole story behind that, I go into great detail on that in my Space Amoeba review. But Ishiro Honda had quit Toho. And so Jun Fukuda is brought in. Now, Jun Fukuda, as many of you know, has worked on a couple of Godzilla films before this. He worked on Son of Godzilla and Sea Monster. What Jun Fukuda was very good at doing was both physical stuff, and he was good at doing great human characters, great human casts. In all of his films, even Megalon, I can't say that he doesn't have an interesting human cast. They're very lively. Even though they may not have complete 3-dimensional characters, they're very lively, and above that, they're memorable. One of my favorite examples of his characters being very memorable is the corn guy from Godzilla vs. Gigan. Does he have a character? Fuck no. But you know him because he's the hippie who likes to eat corn. That's something very memorable that will always stick out in your head. Now, Godzilla vs. Gigan had an even smaller budget than Godzilla vs. Hedorah. It really shows because of the amount of stock footage that is used in this movie. However, the film was shot by this guy. The guy who was the director of the photography of the film was a man who directed a lot of samurai and martial arts films, and he never directed another kaiju film after this. But, as I just said, he directed a lot of samurai martial arts films. And boy does it show, because he uses a lot of close, tight face framings. Like, he uses the widescreen. The cinematography in Godzilla vs. Gigan is by far my favorite thing with that film. Especially since I watched it recently. Every shot looks really good. It's very crisp, and every movement that the camera makes is very precise. There's no kind of like improvisation with the camera. The camera is very aware of itself, and all the shots are very tight on a lot of people's faces and so on and so forth. The shots are just really tight, and that really helps the final battle sequence between Godzilla, Anguirus, King Ghidorah, and Gigan. That was also pretty ballsy, considering the fact that they had 4 monsters fighting and not just 2. And some people ask, like, why Anguirus? Anguirus was chosen for an economic reason, and that's it. And that's because there was a new Anguirus suit in the Toho lot made for destroying all monsters just sitting there. The Godzilla suit, even Jun Fukuda was like, we need to make a new one, but Toho was like, we can't afford to make a new one, so they pushed out one more film with it, and that's why there's several scenes where you can see like the scales kind of falling off of Godzilla, is because it was in such disrepair, it was literally falling apart, and it's kind of strange too, considering how much, it's like they knew that this was the last movie they were going to get out of that Godzilla suit, and so they decided to just blow it up, essentially, by the end of the film, and kind of helped the film in a few ways, because Godzilla gets all sorts of fucked up in not just this film, but in the 70s series in general. He gets all sorts of fucked up. Again, this is one reason why the 70s series is so fascinating. But again, a lot of that cinematography and stuff, really specifically in Godzilla vs. Gigan, had such a small budget that they had to be very precise where the camera moves and everything. And because of that, the choreography and the cinematography in Godzilla vs. Gigan is some of the most beautiful and dynamic in any kaiju film ever. Not just Godzilla, not just for Godzilla, I mean for any kaiju film ever. I mean, I still think it's one of the most dynamic and most beautifully done Godzilla fights ever. The stuff that's not stock footage. And I mean that, because you have Anguirus in the background fighting King Ghidorah, and then you have Godzilla and Gigan fighting in the forefront, or vice versa, and they're always moving, and they're crisscrossing each other. I'm getting excited just talking about this. And it's great stuff. I mean that. It's great stuff. It looks great. It is great. And again, all the shots are very tied up. You get a lot of expressions and a lot of emotions. And it doesn't also help. And it does also help that the music choice for Godzilla vs. Gigan is very good. It was all recycled music from Akira Ifukube. You know, they were like, we don't have the money to get an orchestra to do music or to hire a new music guy, so they just used what they had in their lot, which was nothing but a bunch of recycled Akira Ifukube music. Great choices of the editor, too, for picking out what he liked and everything. It worked very, very well, in my opinion. You know, that's in great contrast to, again, that was also a conscious decision made because it was something familiar. Godzilla vs. Gigan was something very familiar, where aliens take over try to invade the Earth, Godzilla winds up fighting the monster, and so on and so forth. That was a very familiar plot by this time. It had been done twice before. It had been done in Invasion of Astro Monsters and Destroy All Monsters. Godzilla vs. Hedorah, they hired Richiro Manabe, who was known for doing a lot of horror music scores and pornos. Those are the two kinds of music that he was really known for. And I think he's a very good composer. And I love his Godzilla theme and everything like that. I do. But actually, in terms of the Showa series, there's two Godzilla themes that I can think of. One is Akira Ifukube's, and the other is Richiro Manabe's. Those are the two themes that I can think of, because they weren't just used in one film, they were used in multiple films. Because Richiro Manabe's score was so kind of out there, out in left field, it was another decision to go with Akira Ifukube because it sounded familiar. It was something they knew could be safe and would make the money, and sure enough, it did. It made them quite a bit of money. Not as much as Godzilla vs. Hedorah, but it made them quite a significant amount of money. By 1973, with Godzilla vs. Megalon, the film studio system was even in more shambles, and that's why we had to mess up. The film was shot in 3 weeks. The Godzilla suit was made in only a week. Stuff like that, and relied heavily on stock footage. No real big city destruction sequences. All the destruction sequences in that movie were stock footage. That's the movie where it was shown off the most. However, what's interesting with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla was that there were a series of giant disaster epics released in Japan at that time that were very ambitious. One of them was The Submersion of Japan, which is a pretty damn good movie. Wonderful destruction sequences. That was a huge hit, and that gave Toho a lot of money. And they were like, well, okay, let's try to give those to the Godzilla series. Especially with Terror of Mechagodzilla. Terror of Mechagodzilla and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla actually got a decent amount of money. And so there was very little stock footage in it. And there were a lot of explosions, very dynamic fights, grand cinematography, very ambitious effects, and so on and so forth, especially in Terror of Mechagodzilla. By this time, both Sadamasa Arakawa and Eiji Tsuburaya, Eiji Tsuburaya had died and Sadamasa Arakawa had left Toho. Teruyushi Nakano, quite frankly, wanting to keep his job, wound up being promoted to director. And that's something else that's very interesting about the 70's series. It's like, as soon as Eiji Tsuburaya died, it was like suddenly everyone was like, let's get Godzilla bloody. And so, again, that's why in Godzilla vs. Gigan, that's the first time we ever see Godzilla bleed. Godzilla gets all sorts of fucked up in that movie. He gets his jugular cut, he spits blood everywhere, then Gigan, splits open his head. It's very gruesome. And then in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, Anguirus gets his jaw ripped open, there's a lot of blood there. Godzilla gets all sort of fucked up in that movie because he gets missiles jabbed into him and he's bleeding all over the place. That was something fascinating about the 70's Godzilla era, is because that never would have happened in the 60's. Sure, we have got bloody monster movies. Look at the Gamera films. The Gamera films were pretty damn gory. But Eiji Tsuburaya was a huge proponent that blood wasn't good in his movies. He didn't like blood in his movies. So that was predominantly out of respect for him, a lot of the reason why, Sadamasa Arakawa and them never did that much for blood in their kaiju films. But once Eiji Tsuburaya died, it was like that was out the window. And so, again, we had all that. And also, Teruyushi Nakano was a pyrotechnician by heart. And as a result of that, we see more explosions than in any other Godzilla series ever, quite frankly, in my opinion, in those 70's Godzilla films. I mean, you have the oil refinery in Godzilla vs. Hedorah. That was spectacular. You have the oil refinery in Godzilla vs. Gigan when frickin' Godzilla and Anguirus land and have that battle at the oil refinery in Godzilla vs. Gigan. It is so beautiful because you just see the flames. There's just one shot where it's like Godzilla and Anguirus look like they're getting swallowed by the flames, And then you have Akira Ifukube's music going on over that, over Gigan's roar, and then you have King Ghidorah doing his electric shit. That was wonderful. That's another thing, too. It was, the special effects crew had to be very careful how they shot, and that's one reason why the fight scenes were usually very, very well done, is because they had to be very careful where to shot, or where to shoot, because the special effects crew was severely undermanned. They had to let go so many people. That's one reason why in Godzilla vs. Gigan, King Ghidorah looks like shit. How his head's just kind of like bob like this. That's because normally it would take 3 to 4 people to just move one of their heads. But they only had like 2 people working on him, so they couldn't do that much with his heads and stuff like that. That's also another reason why there was a lack of strenuous kaijus made around this time. All the kaijus made were very kind of pragmatic in terms of wires. You know, they didn't need that many wires, so their tails can move on their own. Megalon, for example, Hedorah, for example, Gigan, for example. Well, Gigan, they had a wire on his tail. But Megalon didn't have a wire on his tail, and neither did Hedorah. And Titanosaurus especially didn't need one. It could be totally moved by the body and so on and so forth. In fact, that's one reason why Titanosaurus was made in general, was because they wanted something very simple to make, something very pragmatic that could be made cheaply. And so they went with an aquatic dinosaur approach. And quite frankly, it really looked... In terms of all the kaiju that was made, Titanosaurus looks like one of the most realistic ones, you know, in terms of its design. It looks like this could actually exist in the real world. And that was done actually not because it was supposed to look like that way, but mainly because it was a suit that could be cheaply made. They were also very lighthearted. The 70s Godzilla films were very much so geared more for younger audiences. They kept their plots pretty damn simple. They kept the characters very, not cartoonish, but again, memorable. The result of that was pretty interesting considering the direction that suddenly they went in with Terror of Mechagodzilla. I don't know if someone at Toho smelled death in the air for Godzilla, but it was like, that is the true swan song for the Showa Godzilla, Ishiro Honda, Akira Ifukube, everything. It was like, it's a true swan song just because of how dark that movie is. Because, like, you have Hedorah, but even that had its moments. You have Gigan, Megalon, and Mechagodzilla, which are very, very fun movies. They're not overly intelligent. I mean, Mechagodzilla has its moments, but they're not really intelligent. They're just fun movies to sit down and eat popcorn to with your kids. That's what they are. Then you've got Terror of Mechagodzilla that comes in, which Ishiro Honda helms, because quite frankly, he needed money. That's the only reason why he agreed to do that movie, was because he needed money. And so, all of a sudden you've got this really dark and depressing movie. I think that's, quite frankly, after rewatching the film recently, Terror of Mechagodzilla is the darkest Godzilla film made, quite frankly, since the original. The themes in that film, here's how I guess you can describe Terror of Mechagodzilla. Terror of Mechagodzilla is something made in the universe of the 70s, but made with the themes of the early 60s. That's the best way I can describe it. It's so dark and it's so brooding, and that even goes back to Akira Ifukube. And what was interesting about that was because of such successful films as Prophecies and Nostradamus and all them, and Submersion of Japan, they gave Terror of Mechagodzilla a larger budget than usual, thinking that it was going to be a big hit. Unfortunately, what wound up happening was that there was a huge oil shortage in Japan, and people didn't go out to see it. I mean, I think Terror of Mechagodzilla was the least attended Godzilla. I think it even beat Megalon for that role. Because Megalon wasn't very successful either. Mechagodzilla was successful, but Terror of Mechagodzilla was even less of a success than Megalon. And so that brought Godzilla to an end. And I personally think, despite what people say, I personally think Toho thought that Godzilla was going to come to an end with this film, because the way how it's shot, the way how it's edited, and the amount of attention to detail that movie has. Again, like the last shot of Godzilla walking away, the themes of Katsura dying, even the use of Akihiko Hirata as Dr. Mifune, kind of rounding out, you know, the whole thing with him being Dr. Serizawa in the first film, everything like that. And I think Ishiro Honda felt it. I think Ishiro Honda knew from the get-go that this was probably going to be his last film, because Ishiro Honda, quite frankly, not only was sick of kaiju films, but he was just sick of movies in general. He was just kind of done. He just didn't want to make movies really anymore. And that's why the only movies he ever worked on was with his friend Akira Kurosawa after this. But I think they personally did smell death in the air, and they said this was going to be the final goodbye for Godzilla. If it was a success, good. But I don't think they were truly planning on any Godzilla movies being made after this. Maybe they had stuff in their mind just in case it was a success, but I don't think they really truly had any intentions on making any more. I know that that's not confirmed, and a lot of sources can state to the otherwise, can state that they had more ideas and stuff like that. I personally don't think anyone really did. Personally, I think it was always in the back of their minds. That's why they made it the way they did. But the 70s series is just so interesting because of that. It was so interesting from a filmmaker standpoint because they had nothing and they had to make something. A lot of people can say that to the later Gamera films as well, but I think the later Godzilla films did it better. Way better. Because not only that, but they realized that you needed a decent story or decent characters to carry your films. The Gamera movies never got that. Quite frankly, I always found the Gamera movies, with a few exceptions, I found the Showa Gamera films, their stories lacking and their characters lacking. The later Godzilla films, the 70s Godzilla films, really had pretty interesting stories. Not smart stories, but interesting stories, and definitely memorable characters to really carry everything out. And that's what also made them stand out, is that, you know, they focus more on the writing and more on the action and everything like that, so that they can compensate for their lack of budget for the effects, which is another cool artistic thing that I praise the 70s series for. And they were very more calculated with their actual effects because of their lack of budget. You know, again, it goes down to they had nothing, but yet they had to make something. And that's admirable, to say the least. Even if you don't like the 70s Godzilla films, and I met several fans that don't, and this sounds like I'm praising a lot of them, but no, the 70s Godzilla films, with the exception of Terra Mechagodzilla and in many ways Hedorah, those three in the middle are kind of really stupid. They're really stupid, but they're a load of fun. That's the key. They're a load of fun. Even if you don't like them, if you know the production behind those movies and the production history of Toho and everything like that, it's actually very inspiring. It's a very inspiring story that these people had nothing, but yet they made something. That's cool. And in fact, it inspires me to go out there and make more films. It inspires me to keep going out there and work on Which Way They Walk. Very, very inspiring. And that's what I wanted to get across in this video, is that they had nothing, but yet they made some really cool shit in the process. It's really admirable, and I really wanted to talk about that. I really wanted to, quite frankly, praise the people, Teruyushi Nakano, Jun Fukuda, Yoshimitsu Banno, Shiro Honda. I wanted to praise them for being able to, quite frankly, not only make the stuff that I remembered the most, because it's the 70s Godzilla films that I really remember the most, because they played on TV a lot, but for also being able to be very creative. And quite frankly, I think those movies are a work of art. Even Megalon. I think those movies are a work of art in their own ways. Are they good art? Yeah, that's up for debate. But I do think they're a work of art. They're an art of something. And just from a filmmaker's standpoint, absolute art to me. Art. They had nothing, and yet they made something. I'm going to stop rambling on at this point. So, I hope you enjoyed. Do like Which Way They Walk on Facebook. Stay tuned for the release of that movie. Do like AN Productions on Facebook. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. And tell me what you think of the 70s Godzilla series in the comment below, or even comment of a video for the Godzilla vlogs that you would like to see in the near future. So, in the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, sayonara.